Hi there, my name's Emma Erdman, and today I'm going to talk to you about why preschool is the most important school to a child's development. Now, often preschool is considered to just be fun and games, but it's often a lot more than that. During this time, great psychological as well as physiological development happens for these children. For example, children learn to increase their self regulation, which is the ability to take their emotions and transmit them to their peers, to their parents, and to their teachers in an appropriate and socially polite way. Additionally, children show an increase in their creativity as well as their processing. So, those imaginary role play games that children do actually are very significant to this because children can practice their communication skills with their peers, the creativity and imagination that can build upon itself, as well as their processing for information. As well, children go through phonological, which is language, as well as memory development. So in these early childhood learning centers, children are exposed to numbers, textures, colors, sounds, smells, as well as different vocabulary that they would not be exposed to otherwise. So children take all of that information and they internalize it. And even if they're too young to adequately externalize it to their family or to their peers, they still have that in their brain and it's developed so that when they go into education in elementary school, they're much further ahead than their peers that don't have that memory development. And so children that are more developed in their early years are actually shown to be more integral into society later on in life. And so the Department of Education found that for every $1 investment spent on early childhood education, there's actually a return of $8.60 for every dollar spent. And so that comes from children that are better educated as early on, go on to college and more lucrative careers like doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, that sort of thing. So, even though early childhood education is incredibly important, it's not well funded, and we all know that better funded education has a higher quality overall. And so there's different kinds of early childhood learning programs. There's federally funded ones like Head Start, which is made for low-income families, as well as special education facilities. And then there's state and locally funded facilities, which are non-for-profits, as well as private institutions. And so the first kind, public early childhood centers, are deeply flawed in that there's simply not enough space for all children to go that want to go. And those facilities don't have the money to expand to allow more children to go. In fact, the Department of Education found that 6 out of every 10 4-year-old children cannot attend public preschools. So while public preschools actually benefit these 4 children that are able to go, these 6 children have to find alternatives if they want to go to preschool. So the alternative option that they have would be to go to a private early childhood center. However, these programs are too expensive to accommodate low or middle class families. Parents simply can't afford the tuition. Nationally, they average around $12,000 per child per year. This leaves parents stuck in an impossible situation. Do their children not go to preschool and possibly suffer academically in comparison to their peers later on in life? Or do they come up with thousands of dollars that the families simply don't have? So, while early childhood in America is pretty dismal, it's actually worse in Missouri. The statistic that we just discussed, that 40% of children nationally attend preschools, that number is only 19% in Missouri. And that's not due for the lack of interest in preschools. It's simply the lack of space and the lack of tuition funding. And so Missouri gives very little funding to the preschools that it does have. Annually, it spends $600 million on prisons, while it spends $37 million on preschools. Now, we know that Kansas City is known for its diversity and its appreciation of different cultures and different backgrounds, which would make you believe that they would place some importance on minority funding to go to preschools or even a minority-centric preschool. However, that is not the case. In Kansas City, 40% of children that attend preschools are Latino. 50% of African Americans get to attend preschool, as opposed to 63% of white children. Now, it's obvious that there are some general trends in preschool across America and in Kansas City. There's simply not enough space in the facilities that exist, with no money to expand on them. As well, there's not enough funding to run the existing facilities, which causes the tuition rates to rise to unrealistic proportions for families. Now, there have been some federal initiatives to help account for this. One example is Obama's modification to Head Start back in 2011. So this initiative basically said that all Head Start facilities had to apply to an oversight committee. And that oversight committee looked through their facility, looked through their curriculum requirements, as well as what they were spending and what they were charging. And if those Head Start facilities did not meet the requirements that the oversight committee set, their funding was revoked and they had to reapply for funding. So this drastically increased the quality of Head Start programs, but it didn't increase the number of them, which is what the preschools truly need at this moment. As well, there was something called the Early Learning Childhood Challenge Program that was established. And this was a federal grant that was given to states on an application basis. And though over 40 states applied, only 20 received some portion of funding, and that portion of funding that they received was often very small. So, though there haven't been many successful federal initiatives, Kansas City has taken it upon themselves to come up with local initiatives that have some basis of success. So, back in 2016, the Amendment 3 tax was introduced, and this tax detailed a 60-cent increase over 4 years on all tobacco-related products. However, this tax was shot down 1.6 million votes to 1.1 million votes because the opposition argued and campaigned and advertised that revenue would be controlled by an unelected commission and an unelected board. And because this commission was unelected, it could be appointed with whoever the Kansas City legislature desired. They didn't have to have any kind of background in education. And so the opposition argued that that was unacceptable and that only those educated with knowledge of schools should have control of that money, which was founded. And so earlier this year, on April 2nd, the sales tax initiative was voted on. And the sales tax initiative detailed a 3/8-cent tax on every sale in Kansas City. And this tax was introduced by Mayor Sly James and to further supplement the early learning childhood programs in Kansas City. This tax was proposed to generate $30 million in revenue. And it contained a multi-step plan. One step of the plan was tuition discounts to private institutions for families that could not afford it. One part was grants for learning and early childhood centers to supplement the space that they have, as well as to increase the quality of the education that they were giving, as well as infrastructure development for more early childhood programs to be built later on in the future. And so that $30 million was to be generated in one fiscal year, and the estimated cost per person was about $58 per person. So even though it would generate a huge sum of money, it was still a fairly low cost on an individual basis. However, every single board superintendent for the Kansas City school boards, which was 14 of them, voted against it. And this was because, though there were some minor details, the main reason was because the revenue was directed to private institutions instead of the public institutions that they held positions in. So because of this, the disagreement between the superintendents and Mayor Sly James, this was voted down. Now, though there have been a whole array of solutions proposed to gain more funding, I think that the most promising one was Mayor Sly James, though it does need some modifications because it wasn't perfect for Kansas City or our community. Now, the first part of the initiative that I would propose with modifications would be to open the funding generated from the revenue to any institution. Instead of just private institutions being allowed to apply, it could be public institutions, non-for-profit institutions, publicly funded institutions, even religious programs that would be held in religious institutions like those early daycare centers and churches. This is because by opening it to all programs across the board, you're opening it up to programs that are part of the community. They understand the needs, and then that reduces the school superintendent's argument that it was creating essentially a voucher system for early childhood education, and the Kansas City superintendents did not like that. The second part of this initiative would be to increase the revenue given directly to the schools. So in the initial sales tax initiative, only 30% of revenue was directed to the early childhood programs themselves. I would say that at least half of the revenue should go directly to the schools, which would help with paying for programming costs, which would help them to expand to allow more students in. This would also allow them to reduce their tuition prices, which would reduce the amount of tuition vouchers needed. So just that cyclical fund of money could be given directly to the schools. Lastly, and this would require cooperation on the state and federal level, is that the money spent on preschool and early childhood education could be tax deductible. So this could take some of the financial burden off of families and allow for less tuition vouchers as well, which would decrease the amount of grant money needed to be given. In conclusion, early childhood education is incredibly important for the strong foundations of our citizens as well as our democracy, because an informed public is a successful public.